How does a modern airliner vanish on a routine overnight flight, leave behind almost no clear explanation, and take nearly 2 years to tell investigators what really happened? That was the riddle of Air France Flight 447. And when the answer finally came, it was not a movie-style mystery. It was something much more unsettling for aviation. A chain of small failures, human confusion, and design limits in one of the most advanced aircraft in the sky. On the night of May 31st into June 4th, 2009, an Airbus A330 left Rio de Janeiro for Paris with 228 people on board. For hours, it was just another long-haul crossing over the Atlantic. Then the last radio contact with Brazilian air traffic control came at 1:35. Between 2:10 and 2:15, the aircraft sent a position message and 24 automated maintenance messages through ACARS. After that, nothing. No distress call, no confirmed explanation. Just silence over one of the hardest places on Earth to search. That silence is what turned one accident into one of aviation's most studied mysteries. Over land, investigators can usually reach a wreck site quickly. Over the mid-Atlantic, that changes everything. The airplane's position reporting was set to about once every 10 minutes. According to the NTSB, at cruise speed and altitude, that created a search area with a radius of roughly 40 nautical miles from the last reported position. In deep ocean, that is enormous. It meant the first question was not why the aircraft was lost. The first question was where it was. The search became a long, expensive technical campaign. Surface debris was found within days, but that did not solve the core mystery. Underwater searches followed in multiple phases. Acoustic searches tried to hear the flight recorder's locator beacons. Side-scan, sonar, and remotely operated vehicles scanned the seabed. Investigators even used Bayesian analysis to combine drift patterns, flight dynamics, prior searches, and uncertainty into a more focused model of where the wreck might be. Only on April 3, 2011, after 4 major undersea campaigns, was the wreckage finally found at a depth of about 3,900 meters, roughly 6.5 nautical miles north of the aircraft's last known position. The flight data recorder was found on May 1st and recovered on May 2nd. The cockpit voice recorder was found and recovered on May 3rd. And this is where the story changes. Because when investigators finally read the recorders, they did not uncover some exotic hidden failure. The official BEA report boiled the sequence down in brutally plain terms: icing of the pitot probes in cruise, erroneous speed indications, a stall, and impact with the ocean. In other words, the mystery was not that the airplane had vanished. The mystery was how a highly automated wide-body jet could get into a full aerodynamic stall at cruising altitude and stay there. To understand that, you have to understand what a pitot tube does. It is one of the sensors that helps an aircraft determine airspeed by measuring pressure from the airstream. According to investigators, ice crystals temporarily obstructed the pitot probes, which made the speed indications inconsistent. That alone did not doom the airplane, but it triggered something important. The autopilot disconnected. The flight control system reverted from normal protections to what Airbus calls alternate law, and the crew suddenly had to manually fly a high-altitude jet at night, in weather, with unreliable speed information. That sounds manageable on paper. In real life, it is one of the hardest situations in transport aviation. High altitude is not forgiving. The FAA notes that aircraft behavior at high altitude can differ significantly from what pilots see lower down, and stall recognition can be more subtle than the training many pilots first learned. The FAA's modern stall recovery guidance now emphasizes one principle above all others. Reducing angle of attack is the most important action in recovering from an impending or full stall. That sounds simple, but under stress, especially when the airplane is already high, dark, and confusing, the correct move can feel wrong. According to the BEA's final presentation, the sequence after the pitot obstruction unfolded in layers. First came the temporary inconsistency in measured speeds. Then control inputs destabilized the flight path. Investigators found that the crew did not make the necessary link between the loss of displayed airspeed information and the appropriate procedure. They also found a late identification of the deviation from the flight path, insufficient correction, and ultimately a failure to diagnose the stall itself. One detail from the investigation stands out because it is so stark. The BEA said the stall warning sounded continuously for 54 seconds after the beginning of the stall, without provoking the appropriate response. That is the part of the story that took years to truly understand. This was not just a sensor problem, and it was not a simple story of one bad decision. The BEA concluded that the accident resulted from a combination of factors. These included the temporary airspeed problem, the crew's control inputs, the failure to recognize the stall, and broader issues around training and cockpit ergonomics. The final report specifically pointed to an absence of training at high altitude in manual airplane handling and in the procedure related to speed indication anomalies. It also pointed to task sharing weakened by startle effect and incomprehension of the situation, a lack of clear cockpit display of the airspeed inconsistencies identified by the computers, and the crew not taking into account the stall warning. That is why this accident still matters. It exposed not just what failed, but how humans and machines can fail together. And this is where a lot of people outside aviation get tripped up. They hear the word stall and picture an engine failure or a wing dropping straight out of the sky. That is not what a stall means. A stall is about angle of attack. The wing is asked to produce more lift than the airflow can support, and it stops flying efficiently. The FAA's training guidance is so clear on this because the instinct to pull can make the situation worse. In a stall, altitude is no longer the first priority. Restoring proper airflow over the wing is. That is why the FAA guidance says reducing angle of attack comes first. In the case of Flight 447, investigators found the crew never successfully made that transition from confusion to correct recovery. The consequences went far beyond one investigation report. The BEA addressed 41 safety recommendations tied to training, flight recorders, certification, search and rescue, ATC, and operator oversight. ESA said, after the accident and the interim reports, it updated technical standards for pitot tubes, launched work on new certification standards for flight in icing conditions, and began action on pilot training and automation policy. In other words, the industry did not treat Flight 447 as an isolated event. It treated it as a warning that modern cockpits needed stronger defenses against confusion during rare but high-consequence failures. The accident also changed how aviation thinks about tracking aircraft over oceans. The NTSB later pointed directly to Flight 447 when arguing that more frequent position reporting would sharply reduce search areas after an accident. It noted that if transport category aircraft reported position once per minute, the last reported position would usually fall within about a 6 nautical mile radius of impact. It also noted that Air France changed its long-haul systems in 2011 to report position once every minute under certain conditions. That is not the kind of reform most passengers ever notice, but it matters. When an aircraft disappears over water, every mile matters. That push eventually fed into broader tracking reforms. ICAO's Global Aeronautical Distress and Safety System, or GADSES, grew out of later work on aircraft tracking and location in distress, with tracking-related provisions adopted in stages from 2016 onward. Flight 447 was not the only event behind those reforms, but it was one of the cases that showed the world how difficult it can be to find an airliner in open ocean, even when investigators know roughly where to look. The mystery was not just in the cockpit. It was also in the vastness below. What makes Flight 447 so important is that it challenged a comforting idea. The idea that once airplanes become advanced enough, the old fundamentals somehow stop mattering. But they do not. Airspeed still matters. Angle of attack still matters. Weather still matters. Training still matters. And when automation suddenly steps back, the human being in the seat still has to understand the airplane at its most basic level. According to investigators, that is the lesson this accident forced aviation to relearn. Not through theory, but through one of the most difficult and expensive investigations in modern airline history. In the end, the mystery that took years to understand was not really about a missing airplane. It was about a modern system pushed into a corner it was never supposed to reach, and about how long it can take to understand a failure when technology, weather, training, human factors, and the ocean all decide to hide the answer at once. And that is why Flight 447 still echoes through aviation today. Because long after the wreckage was found, the deeper question remained the same. When the automation goes quiet, do we still understand how to fly?